Practical Anarchy, A Guide to Self-Determination, Dicky. Section 15. Russia, Soviets, Kronstadt and Makhno. If Spain was the revolution that almost was, Russia was the revolution that was stolen. For anarchists, the Russian Revolution of 1917 began as a dream, but ended as a warning, proof of how quickly a workers' state could become a new machine of domination. When the February Revolution toppled the Tsar, anarchists were active on the streets, in factories and in barracks. Soviet workers and soldiers' councils looked like something out of Kropotkin's notebook, delegates elected and recallable, decisions made collectively, federations springing up across the empire. Anarchists hailed them as living organs of a free society. The anarchist presence was not small. In Petrograd, later named Leningrad, and now known as St. Petersburg, the House of Anarchy was seized in 1917, with banners declaring, "Death to all who stand in the way of freedom." Dozens of anarchist papers appeared across the country. Berezovnik, Storm Patrol in Petrograd, Galos Trudeau, Voice of Labour in Moscow, echoing syndicalist calls for workers' control. Blackguard militias controlled some districts, expropriating the rich and distributing resources. For a time, anarchists and Bolshevik militants fought side by side, storming police stations and taking on counter-revolutionaries. In October, when the Bolsheviks seized power, many anarchists welcomed the overthrow of the provisional government. Even Kropotkin, frail and aged after years in exile, cautiously welcomed the revolution. He had returned to Russia in June 1917, greeted by cheering crowds at the Finland station. For decades, he had dreamed of a social revolution, and the fall of Tsarism seemed like its opening act. Yet his position was complicated. During the First World War, Kropotkin had shocked many comrades by supporting the Allies against Germany, arguing that a German victory could crush freedom across Europe. This defensist stance split the anarchist movement, with many denouncing him as a sellout. Back in Russia, Kropotkin admired the Soviets as living examples of self-organisation, but he was deeply suspicious of the Bolsheviks' centralising tendencies. He warned Lenin in private letters that replacing Tsarist bureaucracy with party bureaucracy would only reproduce tyranny in a new form. His voice carried moral weight, but by then the momentum of events had left him on the margins. He spent his final years in Dimitrov, writing and corresponding, too frail to intervene directly. The break between anarchists and Bolsheviks came fast. Independent anarchist papers were shut down, anarchist centres raided. By 1918, blackguard groups in Moscow were crushed in armed assaults by the Kruchetka, the state secret police. The revolution that had promised liberty was narrowing into party rule. When Lenin published State and Revolution in 1917, he sounded almost anarchist, promising the withering away of the state once workers had seized power. Many anarchists hoped the Bolsheviks meant it, but in practice, Lenin insisted on centralised party control. The Soviets were tolerated only so long as they backed the Bolsheviks. When they acted independently, they were sidelined or dissolved. Marx's ghost loomed large. His idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat had always split the movement. For Marxists, it meant a temporary step towards communism, but for anarchists like Bakunin, it meant the birth of a new ruling class. In Russia, that fear seemed to come true. The Communist Party became the state, and the temporary dictatorship hardened into permanent hierarchy. Trotsky, as Commissar for War, embodied this shift. When their authority was challenged, the betrayal became undeniable in 1921 at Kronstadt. The sailors, long hailed as the pride of the revolution, rose demanding Soviets without Bolsheviks, free elections, freedom of speech, equal rations. The demands echoed anarchist principles of direct democracy and equality. Trotsky and the Red Army crushed the uprising in ice and blood. For anarchists, Kronstadt was the moment the mask slipped. The revolution had eaten its own children. Meanwhile in Ukraine, another path had flickered into life. Nestor Makhno, a peasant from Heliopol, led the Makhno-Vishchina, an anarchist movement that fought both Reds and Whites. The Reds were the Bolsheviks' forces seeking to centralise power under a one-party state, whilst the Whites were a mix of monarchists, conservatives and foreign armies trying to restore the old order. His Black Army organised guerrilla war against monarchists, nationalists and Bolsheviks alike, but it wasn't just an army. In the territories they held, people tried to build a new world from below. Villages collectivised land, abolishing landlords and redistributing estates. Farms were often run on communal lines, their decisions taken in assemblies where every villager had a voice. In towns, workers took over factories, elected committees and kept production going for local needs rather than bosses' profits. These collectives weren't imposed, they emerged organically, with some villages choosing to farm individually, others collectively. The principle was freedom of choice with a federated framework. Military organisation reflected the same spirit. Makhno's commanders were elected, orders could be challenged, and discipline came from mutual respect rather than hierarchy. The Black Army moved fast, using guerrilla tactics against much larger forces, but its real strength lay in its connection to its peasantry. This wasn't just an army passing through, it was their sons and daughters fighting to defend the land they were remaking. Cultural life flourished too. The Makhnovists encouraged free schools based on libertarian education, followed models close to those of Francisco Ferrer in Spain. They defended freedom of speech and association. Even hostile groups were allowed to publish, so long as they didn't take up arms against the communes. For a brief moment, southern Ukraine lived a form of anarchist federalism under fire. But survival was precarious. The Makhnovists had to fight on multiple fronts, against white generals like Denikin and Rengel, against German and Austro-Hungarian occupiers, and finally against the Bolsheviks, who saw their example as intolerable competition. Again and again the Reds signed temporary alliances with Makhno to defeat common enemies, then turned on him once victory was secured. By 1921, betrayed and outgunned, the Black Army was destroyed. Makhno fled into exile. His comrades hunted him down. Even in defeat, the Makhnovishchina left a mark. It proved that anarchist principles weren't just fine words in pamphlets, they could guide whole regions in war and peace. For peasants who had lived under czars and commissars alike, their memory of freedom, chosen assemblies and communal fields survived long after the guns fell silent. The lesson was bitter but lasting. Bakunin had warned decades earlier that a dictatorship of the proletariat would become just another dictatorship. The Russian Revolution proved him right. For anarchists everywhere, in 1917 became a symbol of both hope and betrayal, the promise of Soviets, the tragedy of Kronstadt, the heroism of Makhno, and the sad spectacle of Kropotkin watching his lifelong dream twisted by centralisation. It was the revolution that showed not only how far people could rise, but how quickly hierarchy, even dressed in red, could drag them back down. Beyond Spain, global currents. While Spain and Russia stood out as the great laboratories of anarchist revolution, the 20th century also saw anarchism take root in many other soils. From Italy to Argentina, from Japan to Korea, from Palestine to South Africa, movements bloomed and adapted, showing that the desire for life without rulers was not confined to Europe's hotbeds. Italy. Malatesta's long struggle. Enrico Malatesta, the Italian veteran of anarchism, spent half a century organising, agitating and enduring exile. He fought with Bakunin in the First International, smuggled arms to insurrectionists and returned to Italy after the First World War to rally workers. Malatesta insisted that anarchism was not just about theory, but about practical organisation, neighbourhood clubs, workers' circles, co-ops. In the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years of 1919 to 1920, Italian workers occupied factories, often running them under workers' control. For a brief moment, it seemed like Italy might follow Spain's path, but Mussolini's fascists soon rose on the wreckage. Latin America, syndicalism and rebellion. In Argentina, anarchism was a mass force by the early 20th century. Fora organised strikes, mutual aid and education on a huge scale. Its papers reached tens of thousands. Its strikes paralysed Buenos Aires. In Mexico, anarchist currents influenced the revolution of 1910 to 1920, particularly through the Magonistas, followed by Ricardo Flores Magón, who demanded land reform, indigenous self-rule and free communes. In Cuba, anarchists organised sugar workers and ran workers' schools. In Brazil, anarchists played leading roles in general strikes, pressing for an 8-hour day and against military military conscription. Across Latin America, anarchism often mixed with local traditions of communal life, making it more than just an important ideology. Asia, anarchism and anti-imperialism. Japan saw one of the strongest anarchist movements in Asia. Thinkers like Kotoku Sushai translated Kropotkin and argued for direct action. Workers and peasants organised against both landlords and the state. The repression was fierce. The high treason incident of 1910 saw Kotoku executed along with others accused of plotting to kill the emperor. In Korea, anarchism became entangled with the anti-colonial struggle against Japanese rule. Korean anarchists built schools, rural cooperatives and guerrilla networks, seeing anarchism as both a tool of liberation and a philosophy of equality. In China, anarchism inspired sections of the May 4th movement, with young radicals in Beijing and Guangzhou linking freedom from the state with liberation from Confucian hierarchy. Africa, anarchism against empire. Though often overlooked, anarchist ideas also touched Africa. In Egypt, anarchists, many of them Italian and Greek immigrants, were active in Alexandria and Cairo around the turn of the century, publishing papers and linking with local workers' movements. In South Africa, anarchism and syndicalism found expression in the early labour movement. The Industrial Workers of Africa, formed in 1917, drew on the ideas of the Industrial Workers of the World, founded in Chicago in 1905. It was a radical labour union that aimed to organise all workers across trades, races, nationalities into one big union. Local anarchists to organise black workers against both colonial rule and capitalism. These early sparks laid groundwork for later libertarian socialist currents that would resurface in the struggle against apartheid. The kibbutz experiment. In Palestine, the kibbutz movement offered another glimpse of communal living. Founded by Jewish settlers in the early 20th century, kibbutzim abolished private property, worked land collectively and made decisions in general assemblies. Meals, childcare, labour were shared. For decades, kibbutzim embodied principles of mutual aid and equality. They were tied to Zionist nation building and later to the Israeli state. They showed both the promise and the compromises of collective life at scale. Anarchism in the wider world. From Malatesta's Italy to Argentina's unions, from Japan's martyrs to Palestine's communes, from Cairo's presses to South Africa's syndicalists, anarchism in the early and mid-20th century travelled far. It adapted to new terrains, mixing with peasant traditions, anti-colonial struggles and experiments in communal living. Spain and Russia may have burned brightest, but the sparks spread globally, proving that the hunger for life without rulers was not a European peculiarity, but a human constant. These movements showed that anarchism could travel and adapt to factories and fields, to anti-colonial struggles and communal experiments, yet the century ahead would be harsh. Fascism, Stalinism and colonial repression struck hard, determined to stamp out even the memory of self-rule. What followed was not the flourishing of anarchism, but its persecution. Yet, against the odds, the ideas refused to die.